My foster twins only ate food I dropped on the floor by accident. What they told the therapist got 6 people arrested. The first time I noticed the pattern was during breakfast on their 3rd morning in my house. I'd placed scrambled eggs and toast on plates in front of Ivy and Owen, both 7 years old, identical except for the surgical scar running down Owen's chest from a heart defect repaired in infancy. They sat motionless at the kitchen table, hands in their laps, staring at the food like it might explode. I encouraged them to eat, demonstrating with my own fork, explaining they didn't need permission. They didn't move. Not a twitch, not a glance at each other, just absolute frozen stillness that made my skin crawl. I'd been a therapeutic foster parent for 6 years, certified for the cases other families wouldn't take, but this level of food fear was new. I tried patience, then gentle coaxing, then simple statements that food was safe and they could eat whenever hungry. Nothing. The eggs went cold. The toast got hard. They sat like statues until I finally cleared the plates 40 minutes later, my stomach twisting with concern about what kind of conditioning created this response. Lunch was sandwiches, carefully cut into quarters, served with apple slices and cheese cubes. Same result. They stared at the food with expressions I couldn't read, something between longing and terror, but neither child touched anything despite obvious hunger. Their intake paperwork from Child Protective Services noted failure to thrive in their previous placement, which was putting it mildly. Ivy weighed 38 pounds and Owen weighed 35, both significantly underweight for 7-year-olds. Their caseworker, an exhausted woman named Trisha Okafor, had mentioned behavioral issues around mealtimes, but provided no useful details about what that actually meant. I made mental notes to call her after the kids went to bed, assuming there were protocols or triggers I needed to understand. Dinner approached and I decided to try something different. Setting the table but staying in the room, maintaining a calm presence without pressure. They sat. They stared. They didn't eat. My husband Graham came home from his shift at the fire station, took one look at the situation, and immediately understood this wasn't typical foster kid adjustment. That night, after we'd finally given up and sent them to their shared bedroom, Graham and I sat at the kitchen table trying to make sense of children who refused to eat from plates. He suggested medical issues, maybe sensory problems or previous food poisoning that created associations. I wondered about religious rules or cultural practices we didn't understand, though their file mentioned nothing relevant. We'd fostered 11 kids over 6 years, dealt with attachment disorders and trauma responses and developmental delays, but never encountered children who simply wouldn't eat presented food under any circumstances. Graham pulled up articles about selective eating disorders while I reviewed their placement history again, looking for clues in the sparse documentation. Born to a mother with untreated schizophrenia who'd lost custody when they were 18 months old, placed with maternal aunt for 3 years until she died suddenly of an aneurysm. Emergency placement with paternal grandparents for 6 months before grandfather's stroke left grandmother unable to care for 2 young children alone. Then a series of short-term foster homes, none lasting more than 8 weeks, each reporting escalating behavioral problems without specific details. The breakthrough happened accidentally on their 4th morning. I was making oatmeal, distracted by Graham's phone call about shift trades, and knocked my spoon off the counter. It clattered to the floor, spraying oatmeal across the tile in a beige splatter. I swore under my breath and bent to clean it up, but before I could grab paper towels, Owen was on the floor. He scooped oatmeal into his mouth with both hands, eating so fast I worried he'd choke. His face transformed from blank stillness to desperate animal hunger. Ivy dropped next to him, and they fought over the spilled food, shoving handfuls into their mouths, licking the tile, consuming every trace of oatmeal with the intensity that made my hands shake. I stood frozen, watching my foster children eat garbage off my kitchen floor like starving dogs while pristine bowls of the same oatmeal sat untouched on the table behind them. When the floor was clean, they sat back on their heels, breathing hard, and slowly the blank expressions returned, like shutters closing over their brief moment of revealed need. I called Trisha immediately, explaining what I'd just witnessed while Graham kept the twins occupied in the living room. She went quiet for a long moment, then admitted the previous foster mother had reported similar behavior, but framed it as the children being disrespectful and deliberately difficult. The placement had ended when the foster mother said she couldn't handle kids who preferred to eat like animals, rather than sit at a table like civilized human beings. Trisha's tone suggested she'd believed that characterization, had documented the twins as having severe behavioral issues requiring intensive intervention. I pushed back hard, explaining this wasn't defiance or poor manners, but something much darker. A learned survival response that suggested specific trauma around food and eating. Trisha promised to pull their full case file, including medical records and therapy notes from previous placements. Something in her voice told me she was starting to realize she'd missed something critical in their history, had accepted surface explanations instead of digging deeper into concerning patterns. For the rest of the day, I ran an experiment that made me feel sick. I deliberately dropped food multiple times. Orange slices that rolled across the counter and fell. Crackers I knocked off a plate. Cheese cubes I fumbled while cutting. Every single time, both twins were on the floor within seconds, eating the dropped food with that same desperate hunger, then retreating back to blank stillness once every crumb was consumed. They ignored food on plates, in bowls, offered directly in my hands, but the moment something hit the floor, they transformed into different children. The pattern was absolute and terrifying in its consistency. I documented everything with photos and detailed notes, capturing the contrast between untouched table food and consumed floor food, knowing I'd need evidence to convince people this was real and significant. Graham came home early and watched me deliberately drop a banana, watched the twins devour it off the floor, and his face went pale with understanding. Someone had trained these children that they were only allowed to eat garbage, waste, food that had been discarded or contaminated. Someone had convinced them that regular meals weren't for them. I scheduled an emergency appointment with Dr. Felix Arnaud, the child psychologist I'd worked with on previous cases, describing the behavior and asking for an immediate evaluation. He fit us in the next morning, rearranging his schedule when I explained the urgency. The twins were silent during the car ride to his office, staring out windows with that eerie stillness that characterized their every movement. Dr. Arnaud's office was deliberately child-friendly with toys and books and comfortable furniture, but Ivy and Owen sat rigid on the couch, hands folded, eyes forward, like soldiers awaiting orders. He tried standard rapport-building techniques, asking about favorite colors in games and TV shows, receiving nothing but silence in response. Then he did something I didn't expect. He walked to his desk, picked up a granola bar, unwrapped it, took one bite, then deliberately dropped it on the floor. Both twins' eyes tracked the falling food, their bodies tensing, but they didn't move. They looked at Dr. Arnaud, then at me, then back at the granola bar, clearly torn between hunger and some rule that prevented them from acting without permission in this new environment. Dr. Arnaud knelt down, pushed the granola bar closer to them with his foot, and said very gently that it was okay. They could have it if they wanted. The twins exchanged the briefest glance, some silent communication passing between them, then Owen picked up the granola bar and split it precisely in half. He gave one piece to Ivy, and they both ate quickly, mechanically, swallowing without seeming to taste. Dr. Arnaud sat back slowly and asked if food on the floor was special food, just for them. Owen nodded once. He asked if food on tables was for other people, not for them. Ivy nodded. He asked who taught them that rule. Both children went very still, their faces shutting down completely, and I recognized trauma response when I saw it. They couldn't or wouldn't answer that question, but their silence was its own kind of testimony. Dr. Arnaud looked at me over their heads, and his expression told me we were dealing with something systematic, intentional, and deeply cruel. The session continued for another hour with Dr. Arnaud using play therapy techniques and careful questioning that didn't push too hard on their obvious boundaries. He learned they'd been in 7 different homes since their grandmother could no longer care for them, moving every few weeks when placements failed. He learned they had no friends, didn't attend school regularly, spent most of their time in rooms alone. He learned that Owen's heart condition required medication they hadn't received consistently, that Ivy had nightmares every single night, but had never told anyone what the dreams contained. He learned they believed they were bad children, broken children, children who didn't deserve the same things as normal kids. When he asked why they thought that, Owen said very quietly that they'd been told so many times it had to be true. Multiple adults had explained they were problems, burdens, kids nobody wanted who should be grateful for whatever they got. The casual way he repeated this psychological destruction made my throat tight with rage at every adult who'd failed these children. After the twins went with Dr. Arnaud's assistant to the play area, he closed his office door and told me what he suspected. The food floor association was conditioning, deliberately taught over sustained period to establish hierarchy and dehumanization. Someone had systematically convinced these children they weren't worthy of normal meals, that eating from the floor was their proper place. The behavior was too consistent and too specific to be anything but intentional abuse designed to break their sense of self-worth. He'd seen similar patterns in cases involving organized child exploitation, situations where multiple children were controlled through ritualized degradation. The fact that this had apparently persisted across multiple placements suggested either it started very early and became deeply ingrained, or someone in their recent history had reinforced it deliberately. He was mandating reporting this to CPS immediately and recommending a full investigation into every placement and caregiver in their recent history. Something had happened to these twins that went far beyond normal foster care dysfunction, and we needed to find out what before they could begin healing. Tricia arrived at my house that evening with a detective named Isaiah Kaplan who specialized in child abuse cases. I walked them through everything I'd observed, showed them my documentation, played the video I'd recorded of the twins eating off the floor. Detective Kaplan's jaw tightened as he watched, his hand clenching around his notepad hard enough to bend the cover. He asked detailed questions about timing and consistency, whether I'd noticed any other behavioral patterns that seemed trained rather than organic. I mentioned how they never made noise, never asked for anything, never expressed wants or needs even when obviously uncomfortable, how they flinched at raised voices even when the anger wasn't directed at them, how they slept in the same bed despite having 2 beds available, always positioned with Owen between Ivy and the door like he was protecting her, how they watched adults constantly, tracking every movement with an alertness that felt like hypervigilance rather than normal kid curiosity. Detective Kaplan wrote everything down and told me he was opening a formal investigation, starting with interviews of all previous foster placements and biological family members. The next morning, I deliberately tested another theory that had been forming. I set breakfast on the table normally, but also placed a plate on the floor next to the table, food arranged identically to what was on the table. The twins came down, saw both setups, and immediately went to the floor plate. They ate quickly and thoroughly, finishing everything, while the table food remained untouched. But here's what made my stomach drop. They ate the floor food with their hands, shoving it in quickly, barely chewing, like they expected it to be taken away. But when I tried an experiment later and placed a plate on a chair, low enough to be floor level but technically furniture, they wouldn't touch it. The floor itself mattered. Not low surfaces, not accessible food, but specifically food that had touched the ground. Someone had embedded a rule so specific and so cruel that these 7-year-olds would rather starve than break it. I documented this new variation and sent the video to Detective Kaplan immediately, feeling sick about what it implied about their conditioning. Graham and I started the slow process of reconditioning, trying to show the twins that normal eating was safe and allowed for them. We ate meals on the floor with them, demonstrating that the height of food didn't matter, that all food was for everyone. We used positive reinforcement and patient consistency, never forcing but always offering. Progress was microscopic. After a week, Ivy picked up a cracker from a plate I'd set on the floor and ate it without the plate touching ground first. After 2 weeks, Owen accepted a piece of cheese directly from my hand. After 3 weeks, they could eat from plates on the floor without the food being dropped first. But getting them to eat from table height remained impossible. Something about that specific elevation triggered their conditioning so strongly, they'd shake and sometimes cry if we pushed too hard. Dr. Arno worked with them twice a week, slowly unpacking the trauma through play therapy, but they remained largely nonverbal about their past experiences. Whatever had happened was locked behind walls of fear and learned silence. Detective Kaplan called on a Thursday evening to say he'd interviewed the grandmother who'd cared for them before foster care. She was elderly and frail now, recovering from her husband's death and her own health crisis, but she remembered the twins clearly. She said when they first came to her at age 4, they'd already had the floor-eating behavior. She'd tried to break them of it, assuming it was something they'd picked up from their chaotic early life with their mentally ill mother. But every attempt to make them eat normally resulted in them refusing all food until they became dangerously malnourished. She'd eventually given up and just put their meals on the floor, figuring survival mattered more than manners. She'd asked them once where they learned it, and Owen had said, the training house. But when pressed, he'd shut down completely and wouldn't explain further. The grandmother had assumed it was an imaginary place, maybe something from their mother's delusions that the kids had absorbed. She'd never reported it because she didn't understand its significance. Detective Kaplan's voice was tight with controlled anger when he told me this, knowing we'd lost years of potential investigation because no one had taken a 4-year-old's reference to a training house seriously. The case broke open when Detective Kaplan tracked down the twins' mother's psychiatric records and found something buried in intake notes from 6 years ago. She'd been hospitalized during a psychotic episode when the twins were 13 months old, and during lucid moments had made statements about a man named Virgil who ran a school for broken children. The psychiatric staff had documented this as delusional content, part of her schizophrenic ideation, because she'd described impossible things: underground rooms, dozens of children, systematic training in obedience and silence. But Detective Kaplan ran the name Virgil through databases connected to child welfare and found a match. Virgil Augustine Reeves, previously investigated but never charged in connection with an unlicensed group home operation that was shut down 8 years ago. The children removed from that home had exhibited severe behavioral problems and trauma responses, but the case had been closed when evidence was deemed insufficient for prosecution. Detective Kaplan drove out to my house with a photo, asking if I'd show it to the twins and observe their reaction. The picture showed a man in his 60s with sharp features and cold eyes, standing in front of a large house. I showed the twins the photo casually, saying someone had asked if they recognized this person. The response was immediate and visceral. Owen made a sound like he'd been punched, a sharp gasp of terror. Ivy started shaking so hard I could hear her teeth chattering. Both children backed away from the photo until they hit the wall, then slid down to sitting positions with their arms wrapped around their knees, making themselves as small as possible. Owen whispered, "The educator," in a voice so quiet, I barely heard it. Ivy was rocking back and forth, eyes squeezed shut, clearly in the grip of a flashback or panic attack. I removed the photo immediately and called Dr. Arno while Graham comforted the twins, but the damage was done. They'd confirmed that Virgil Reeves was connected to their trauma in a profound and terrifying way. Detective Kaplan, who'd stayed in his car waiting for results, came inside and saw the twins' ongoing distress. His face went hard with determination, and he made a phone call that apparently activated a larger investigation, because within an hour, 2 FBI agents arrived at my house wanting to interview the children about Virgil Reeves and what they called Operation Clean Slate. The FBI agents, Special Agents Diana Fletcher and Marcus Webb, explained that Virgil Reeves had been on their radar for 3 years as part of a suspected child trafficking network that operated under cover of foster care and adoption services. They'd never been able to build a prosecutable case because children who'd been in his care either couldn't or wouldn't testify about what happened to them. The combination of young age, trauma conditioning, and lack of physical evidence had stymied every investigation. But the twins' specific behavioral conditioning, the floor eating rule, matched details from 2 other children who'd briefly mentioned similar treatment before recanting their stories. If Ivy and Owen could provide testimony about their time in Reeves's care, it might finally give federal prosecutors the breakthrough they needed. But the agents were honest about the challenge. Getting reliable testimony from 7-year-olds who'd been trained into silence would require expert interviewing and probably months of therapy. They were prepared to move slowly and carefully, prioritizing the children's welfare over case timeline. That commitment to protecting my foster kids made me willing to cooperate despite my instincts to shield them from further trauma. Dr. Arnaud coordinated with a specialized forensic interviewer named Dr. Simone Laurent, who'd worked with trafficked children and understood trauma-informed questioning techniques. She came to my house for the first session, establishing that familiar environment would help the twins feel safe enough to talk. She spent the first hour just playing with them, building rapport, demonstrating she was patient and non-threatening. Then she introduced a dollhouse and small figures, inviting them to show her about different places they'd lived. Owen arranged the figures carefully, creating scenes, while Ivy watched and occasionally adjusted pieces. They showed the house with their grandmother, identifying themselves as the small figures who stayed in one room mostly. They showed foster homes, different configurations, always with them isolated from other figures. Then Owen added a basement to the dollhouse, placing 2 small figures down there in the dark. He said very quietly that this was the training room where the educator taught special children how to be better. Dr. Laurent asked gently what kind of training happened there. Owen manipulated the figures, showing them sitting on a floor area. He said the educator explained that some children were born wrong, broken inside, not deserving of normal life. These special children needed to learn their proper place, needed training to understand they were less than regular people. The training included rules about food, speaking, moving, existing. Food from tables was for real people, for whole children, for kids who mattered. Broken children ate from floors, ate what was dropped or discarded, ate like the animals they really were inside. If they tried to eat normal food, they'd be punished. Owen's voice stayed flat and emotionless while describing this, like he was reciting memorized lessons rather than traumatic experiences. Ivy added softly that if one twin broke rules, the other got punished worse. So they learned to follow every rule perfectly, to never make mistakes, to accept their place as broken children who should be grateful anyone cared for them at all. The casual way they described this systematic dehumanization made everyone in the room struggle to maintain professional composure. Dr. Laurent asked how long they were in the training house. Owen said he didn't know exactly, but it was after their mama went away and before their grandma came. He remembered being very small, maybe 3 or 4 based on the details he provided about his size relative to furniture. Ivy remembered Owen getting sick, his chest hurting, and the educator getting angry about the medical problem, saying broken children shouldn't cost money to fix. They remembered other children in the training house, maybe 8 or 10 others, all different ages. They remembered the educator had helpers, at least 3 other adults who supervised the children and enforced rules. They remembered a room with cameras where the educator watched all the children all the time. They remembered being told their family didn't want them. No one would ever want them. They'd stay in the training house forever, learning to be less terrible. Then one day police came and took everyone to different places and they went to their grandmother's house. But the rules stayed in their heads, the training stayed in their bodies, and they couldn't stop following what the educator taught even after he was gone. The FBI moved fast once they had the twins' testimony. They cross-referenced the timeline with the shutdown group home operation from 8 years ago, and confirmed the twins would have been the right age to have been placed there during the brief period it operated. They pulled records of all children who'd been in state custody during that window and removed from Reeves's care. 18 children total, ranging from ages 2 to 9 at the time, all subsequently placed in foster care, many experiencing multiple failed placements due to severe behavioral issues. The FBI began systematic interviews with now teenage victims and their current caregivers, using the twins' specific details to help other survivors identify similar experiences. 6 of the older children, now between 12 and 16, were able to corroborate the training house description and provide additional details about Reeves's operation. He hadn't worked alone. His wife Constance had supervised the younger children. His adult son Gregory had handled discipline. 3 other associates, all with backgrounds in childcare or education, had rotated through as staff. The operation had been sophisticated and organized, designed to break children psychologically while leaving minimal physical evidence. The pattern that emerged from multiple testimonies was devastating in its calculated cruelty. Reeves specifically targeted children from chaotic backgrounds, kids who'd already experienced trauma and wouldn't be closely monitored by overwhelmed social services. He'd operated under the guise of an unlicensed therapeutic group home, positioning himself as someone helping difficult children when traditional foster care failed. Parents and social workers had been desperate enough to overlook red flags, to believe his promises of specialized care and behavioral improvement. Once children were in his control, the training began. Systematic dehumanization disguised as discipline. Children were categorized as broken, defective, less than human. They were taught that basic dignities weren't for them, that they should be grateful for any scraps of care. Different children received different conditioning based on Reeves's assessment of what would break them most effectively. Some, like the twins, learned they could only eat from floors. Others learned they weren't allowed to speak without permission, or to make eye contact with adults, or to use furniture. The specificity and variety of the abuse suggested someone who understood psychological conditioning and deliberately applied it to vulnerable children. The FBI executed search warrants on Reeves's current residence and the property where the group home had operated, now owned by a different family. In the current house, they found documentation that made the case irrefutable. Reeves had kept detailed records of every child who passed through his training program, including photos, behavioral notes, and assessments of their progression through his conditioning protocols. He documented the twins extensively, noting their resistance to floor eating initially, describing the punishment methods he'd used to establish the behavior, celebrating when they finally accepted the rule completely. The records showed he viewed the children as experiments in behavioral modification, testing theories about breaking and rebuilding young personalities. He'd written about plans to eventually monetize his techniques, selling trained children to specific buyers who wanted docile, obedient kids who wouldn't cause problems. The FBI found evidence he'd already completed several such transactions before the operation was shut down, meaning some children had been sold to adoptive parents who specifically wanted pre-broken kids. 6 arrests happened simultaneously across 3 states. Virgil Reeves was taken into custody at his home, charged with multiple counts of child abuse, conspiracy to commit child trafficking, and federal crimes related to interstate movement of minors for exploitation purposes. His wife Constance was arrested at her daughter's house where she'd been living. His son Gregory was pulled from his job at a daycare center, which triggered immediate investigation into that facility. The 3 associates, scattered to different locations, were arrested within hours of each other. All faced decades in prison if convicted on the charges filed against them. The FBI also arrested a man named Kenneth Volpe, who'd been documented as purchasing 2 children from Reeves's operation, children who'd subsequently disappeared from all official records. That arrest expanded the investigation into a darker direction, looking at what happened to children who didn't just get psychologically abused but were sold to predators. The scope was staggering and sickening, revealing a network that had operated for at least 5 years and touched dozens of children's lives. The twins' response to news of the arrests was unexpected. I told them carefully that the educator had been caught and wouldn't hurt any more children. I expected relief or fear or some emotional reaction. Instead, Owen asked if they were still broken. I knelt down to his level and said no, emphatically. They had never been broken. Someone had lied to them, hurt them, tried to make them believe terrible things about themselves. But none of it was true. They were whole, valuable, deserving children who'd survived something horrible. Ivy asked quietly if they could eat from tables now without being bad. I said yes, absolutely. They could eat however they wanted, wherever they wanted, because food was for everyone, and they deserved every good thing. Owen started crying, the first tears I'd seen from him in the month he'd been in my care. Ivy joined him, and they clung to each other, sobbing out weeks of held tension and years of embedded trauma. Graham and I held them both while they cried, witnessing the beginning of their understanding that the nightmare rules no longer applied. The trial preparation process took 8 months. Dr. Laurent worked with the twins and 6 other child witnesses, preparing them to testify in ways that wouldn't re-traumatize them. The prosecution built a case so thorough and documented that the defense had almost no room to maneuver. Reeves's own records condemned him, showing deliberate intent and systematic abuse across multiple victims. The physical evidence from the training house property, preserved in FBI storage from the original investigation, now made sense in context of the children's testimonies. Investigators found the basement room Owen had described, still containing the marked floor areas where children had been required to eat. They found the camera room, equipment removed but mounts still visible in walls. They found evidence of false walls and hidden spaces where children had been isolated as punishment. Every detail the child witnesses provided was corroborated by physical evidence, making the case unusually strong for prosecution of crimes committed years ago. The twins made remarkable progress during those 8 months. With consistent therapy and patient reconditioning, they learned to eat from tables, first just from very low tables, then gradually higher surfaces, until finally they could sit at normal dining height without panic. The process was slow and involved setbacks, moments when stress made them revert to floor eating. But the trend was positive. They started talking more, expressing wants and needs, occasionally even laughing at cartoons or games. They attended school for the first time in years, placed in a specialized classroom with extra support for children with trauma histories. They made friends cautiously, learning that other kids could be safe and fun. Owen's heart condition was properly managed with consistent medication and monitoring. Ivy's nightmares decreased in frequency as she processed trauma with Dr. Arnaud. They were still significantly behind developmentally and would need years of continued support, but they were healing in ways that seemed impossible when they first arrived. The trial itself was relatively brief despite the case complexity. Reeves's defense attempted to characterize his actions as misguided attempts at discipline rather than systematic abuse, but the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution presented testimony from 12 child victims, now ranging in age from 9 to 17, all describing consistent patterns of dehumanization and conditioning. They presented Reeves's own documentation showing deliberate intent and experimental approach to breaking children. They presented expert testimony about psychological abuse and trauma conditioning. The jury took less than 4 hours to return guilty verdicts on all counts. Constance Reeves received a similar verdict. Gregory Reeves tried to claim he'd been following his father's orders without understanding the harm, but testimony from multiple children about his enthusiastic cruelty undermined that defense. He was convicted on most charges. The 3 associates accepted plea deals in exchange for testimony, receiving reduced sentences but still facing prison time. Kenneth Volpe, charged with purchasing children and evidence suggesting further abuse, faced separate trial on even more serious charges. Sentencing happened on a cold morning in November. The judge allowed victim impact statements, and several of the older survivors chose to speak. A 14-year-old girl described years of believing she was worthless, of attempting suicide twice, of struggling to accept that she deserved basic human treatment. A 16-year-old boy described being unable to maintain relationships because Reeves had convinced him he was broken inside and would contaminate anyone who got close. A 12-year-old described still sleeping on floors because beds felt wrong after years of conditioning, that furniture wasn't for children like him. Each statement added weight to understanding of the lasting damage Reeves had inflicted. The judge called the crimes among the most cruel he'd encountered in decades on the bench, describing the systematic destruction of children's self-worth as torture by any reasonable definition. He sentenced Virgil Reeves to 45 years in federal prison. Constance received 30 years. Gregory received 25 years. The sentences ensured none would likely see freedom again given their ages. Graham and I attended the sentencing with the twins, who wanted to be there but weren't required to provide statements given their young age. They sat between us in the courtroom, watching the man who'd tried to destroy them be led away in chains. Owen squeezed my hand tight when the sentence was read. Ivy whispered, "Is it over?" I told her the trial was over. Reeves would be in prison for the rest of his life. He could never hurt children again. She asked if that meant they weren't broken anymore. I said they were never broken, and now everyone knew the truth about who'd really been wrong. On the courthouse steps afterward, other survivors and their families gathered, creating an impromptu support network of people who understood what they'd all survived. Parents exchanged phone numbers. Teenagers compared coping strategies. The twins met other children from the training house for the first time since being separated years ago, recognizing each other instantly despite time and growth. One older boy, maybe 13, told Owen he remembered him being brave when his heart hurt. Owen didn't remember the boy, but accepted the connection, understanding they were part of a shared history of survival. The settlement negotiations with the state took months, but eventually resulted in financial compensation for all victims to fund ongoing therapy and support services. The state also implemented new oversight protocols for group homes and foster placements, mandatory training about recognizing psychological abuse, requirements for documented check-ins that couldn't be easily faked. Reeves's operation had exposed systematic failures in child welfare systems, gaps that allowed predators to operate with minimal scrutiny. The reforms wouldn't fix everything, but they represented acknowledgement that children in state care deserved better protection than they'd historically received. Dr. Laurent published papers about trauma-informed interviewing techniques learned from this case. Dr. Arnaud developed new therapy protocols for children who'd experienced systematic conditioning. The twins' case became a teaching example in social work programs, used to train the next generation of caseworkers to recognize concerning patterns and believe children when behaviors suggested specific trauma histories. 1 year after the arrests, Graham and I filed for adoption. The twins had been with us through the entire investigation and trial, had healed enough to begin considering permanency rather than just safety. We'd talked with them about what adoption meant, that it would make us their legal family forever. Owen asked if forever meant they could stay, even if they made mistakes or were difficult. I promised forever meant exactly that, unconditional and permanent, no matter what. Ivy asked if adoption meant they were fixed now, no longer broken. I explained again that they'd never been broken, but adoption meant they were chosen and wanted and loved, regardless of the lies anyone had told them in the past. The adoption hearing was simple and joyful, nothing like the heavy atmosphere of the criminal trial. The judge, a different one who specialized in family court, approved the adoption with obvious happiness. We took photos on the courthouse steps, the twins between us, all 4 smiling genuinely. They were 8 now, still small for their age but growing steadily with proper nutrition and care. They were thriving in school, making progress socially, learning to trust that good things could last. 2 years after Reeves's sentencing, I received a call from Agent Fletcher updating me on Kenneth Volpe's case. He'd been convicted of multiple counts related to the children he'd purchased and what he'd done to them afterward. Both children had been located, now teenagers, both in intensive therapy for trauma that went beyond even what Reeves had inflicted. Volpe received a life sentence without possibility of parole. The FBI was still investigating whether other buyers existed, whether more children had been sold through Reeves's network, but leads were difficult to follow after so many years. Some children might never be found or identified. That uncertainty haunted me, knowing the twins' story had a resolution many didn't. Fletcher said the case had sparked a federal task force focused on exploitation networks operating within foster care systems, dedicating resources to prevention and investigation. The twins had helped create systematic change that would protect future children, even while they were still healing from their own victimization. Now, 3 years after those first mornings when two silent children wouldn't eat from plates, Ivy and Owen are 10 years old and thriving in ways that seemed impossible during those early dark days. They eat normally now, though stress occasionally brings back old behaviors that require gentle redirection. They attend a regular school and have actual friends who come over for playdates and sleepovers. They're in therapy still, but less frequently, working through remaining trauma at their own pace. Owen plays soccer and loves math. Ivy draws constantly, creating colorful art that covers our refrigerator and hallway walls. They fight like normal siblings sometimes, bicker about toys and television shows, express opinions and preferences without fear. They've learned that taking up space is allowed, that being visible and audible doesn't lead to punishment, that they're children who deserve childhood. Graham and I watch them play in our backyard, chasing each other and laughing, and remember the two frozen silent kids who ate food off floors because they'd been convinced they were broken. They survived something meant to destroy them, helped bring down predators who hurt dozens of children, and came through it choosing to trust again, despite every reason not to. That resilience, that capacity for healing even after systematic attempts to break them, represents hope that trauma doesn't have to define futures. The educator wanted them broken, but they're whole. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.